So the first question, what is affordable housing? So first and foremost, affordable housing does not necessarily mean subsidized housing. It does not necessarily mean public housing. It actually just refers to the fact that it's housing that a household can afford. And by HUD's definition, that's households paying 30% of their income or less. And that's because HUD and others have determined that if you pay more than 30% of your income, you have difficulty affording other necessities like food, clothing, transportation, and medical care. Nationally, currently, it's estimated that 12 million households, that's owners and renters, pay more than 50% of their income on housing each year. These are the current numbers for Louisiana put out by the National Low Income Housing Coalition. They do an interesting calculation that shows what wage a worker would have to make to afford a current two-bedroom apartment. And so the current wage Louisiana would have to make is $16.63 an hour compared to $7.25 an hour, which is our minimum wage. And you can see there they have the numbers for Baton Rouge and New Orleans on this chart. There is no state in the country where a full-time worker making minimum wage can afford fair market rent for a two-bedroom apartment. We know that living in a home promotes financial stability, economic mobility, leads to better health outcomes, improves your school performance, helps individuals gain employment, keep their jobs. And we also know it cuts down on government subsidies needed for things like education, things like social services. It cuts down on jail stays and things like that. I have some additional numbers for New Orleans. Enterprise has done some additional work in New Orleans that shows for every 100 very low income households, New Orleans has, this is a couple years old, I think these numbers are even worse now, but New Orleans has only 47 affordable rental units. So there's a big gap between what's available and what's needed. Question number 2 is, what is the low-income housing tax credit and how do such credits produce affordable rental housing? That's like a 3-day class, so in 3 minutes. So as all of you in this room know, because you've all drunk the Kool-Aid, you're at this conference, but the housing credit is the most successful tool for encouraging private investment in affordable rental housing. Since it was created in 1986, it's financed over 3 million affordable apartments while transferring risk from the government largely to the private sector. These are numbers for Louisiana, and you can find these handy-dandy fact sheets on a website that's called Rental Housing Action. If you Google that, there's a fact sheet for each state that has current fact sheets on the economic benefits of the low-income housing tax credit, which are really good for talking to your legislator about the benefits of the program. So over 67,000 low-income housing tax credit units produced in Louisiana, and a lot of economic benefits for the state beyond just the housing produced. Over 76,000 jobs supported, $7.29 billion in local income generated, $2.87 billion in tax revenue generated, and 158,000 low-income households provided affordable homes. So, and those of us who were here after Katrina and several disasters throughout the state since then have experienced firsthand how important this program was and is in revitalizing neighborhoods that have been devastated by storms and by flooding. And I know several of you in this room are responsible for some of these beautiful developments here. And you can see the program doesn't just create large-scale multifamily properties. It can do single family, it can do townhouses, it can do large-scale multifamily. Housing credit development can help reduce government costs and save taxpayer money. When affordable housing, again, is coupled with supportive services, it can help save costs on those services. So here's a little bit about how it works, and we don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but Treasury Department, I think as most of you know, gives states authority to allocate tax credits to developers of rental housing. This is based on the population of the state. Louisiana is a relatively low population state, so the Louisiana Housing Corporation has a relatively small amount of tax credits to allocate, unfortunately, to developers each year for really good affordable housing projects.
Pause there a moment, Michelle, because what she's talking about, affordable housing with tax credits, this is a program, one of the first programs that's administered, tax programs, federal income tax programs administered by states. In effect, it allocates, as Michelle just said, an amount of credits per capita each year to states to allocate to developments in accordance with her second box there, qualified allocation plan. But I just want to point out, as she's going to move on, there's a second way that credits can be allowed. There's two types of credits. There's the 4%, there's the 9% credit, which is allocated from the housing credit ceiling, and then there's a 4% that is allowed under Section 42H4 if 50% of the total development cost of the land and the improvements of the land are financed with tax-exempt bonds that receive a private activity volume cap under Section 146 of the code. So in the course of these discussions, for purposes of how we get into this concept of assessment of affordable housing projects with tax credits, we'll be talking about both the 9% credit and the 4% credit, but I just wanted to intervene and let you guys know that there are two ways in which credits can be made available to developers.
It's important. The housing that gets built is dedicated to low-income families for 30 years. States determine what housing gets built through what's called a qualified allocation plan, so that's where they set the priorities for that housing. Developers submit projects to the state. Projects are scored according to the qualified allocation plan and are awarded tax credits. In that middle box, developers then trade their credits for capital from investors who can use those credits against their corporate tax liability. This gets a bit complicated. This allows developers to borrow less money to get that development built to cover the cost of construction, reducing the development cost and the need for subsidy.
Yeah, let me just illustrate quickly. We don't have a slide for this, but I'll give you a simple example. For example, if you have a unit that's going to be a beneficiary of a tax credit from the 9% ceiling, what that means is that if, disregarding land for the moment, but if you have construction costs of $100,000, the 9% credit would give an investor $9,000 a year over 10 years for that $100,000 cost. And what the syndicators do that she's mentioning is that they basically put in equity, they'll invest in the taxpayer to reduce the cost. So in the example I just cited of the $100,000 with 9%, that means over 10 years, $90,000 in dollar-for-dollar tax reductions accrued to the investor. But a dollar today is worth more than a dollar tomorrow, and instead of that investor paying you $90,000 just from a discount, so let's assume for the moment that the discount for all of that $90,000 of tax reduction is, say, a tenth. So the investor is going to only pay you 90 cents on the aggregate 90,000 of credits, which means that on that unit that costs 100,000, and you get basically $90,000 worth of credits over 10 years, and the investors only give you 90 cents on a dollar. That's a multiple of 9. You take those $900,000 of credits, I'm sorry, 90,000 multiplied by 9. That's $81,000 of equity, free money for that unit that costs $100,000. It means then that the developer has to find other funds to cover the difference between the $100,000 cost for the improvement and the $81,000 of equity. And it could be covered with a combination of hard debt and soft debt or some form of grants. Well, not grants, because grants don't tax-wise generate tax bases that permit the credit to be taken. But I'm saying this because in the case of the 9%, that's a lot of money. But on the other hand, That same $100,000 unit, if it was financed with the tax exempt bonds that I just described, statutorily there is a 30% present value calculation where the Treasury every month tells you what your credit percentage is, and it's been averaging pretty low. Let's assume for the moment it's 3.5%. So in that same example of 100,000 cost per unit, with the improvement generating on a bond financing of 3.5%, basically 3.5% of 100,000 is 3,500 times 9, so it's $31,500 of equity for that same unit when it's financed with tax-exempt bonds versus the $81,000 when it's getting a 9% credit. So part of this discussion will include, even in the case of the 9%, the challenges that occur when you have to fill the gap and where and how you fill the gap. So, Michelle, I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, that's a good segue. So let's go right into the next question. Really, is how important are property taxes in the development and operation of affordable rental housing? So it sounds like property taxes, that's just a small thing when you've got all these other things. As Wayne said, the tax credit equity is a large chunk of the development cost of your property, but there's always a gap if it's a 4% or a 9% deal. And you generally have to get a loan to fill some of that gap. What determines the size of the loan is a calculation that's based on the net operating income of your property. And your property taxes are often, could be one of your largest operating costs of your property. So they significantly affect your net operating income. So there's two issues with property taxes. Either they're extremely large and they reduce your net operating income significantly, or, as may be the case here, your property taxes are very unpredictable, so your net operating income is very unpredictable and hard to determine. So it's very hard for your potential lender or investor to calculate what's called the debt service coverage ratio, which LHC has a standard of 1.15 debt service coverage ratio to make sure that you can make the payment on your loan based on your net operating income and still have a little bit of cushion so it's not too tight. And when a big chunk of your potential expenses is either a really large number or an unknown number, it causes a lot of concern for your potential lender or your investor, and it will reduce the size of your potential loan significantly. And so what that does is causes you to have to get potentially public subsidy to fill that gap instead of private money, which I would consider, and many would be considered to be really too bad. You could be using private funds in the form of a loan to fill that gap, but instead you're using public money that could be used to build more affordable housing. And it's wasteful when we've got this huge need for affordable housing. We've got 47 units for every 100 residents that need affordable housing, but instead we're having to put that subsidy into this property because of this one issue that we can't solve. So maybe I'll stop there.
And let me put that in context for a moment, because what Michelle just described about property taxes, it's part of a statutorily mandate for housing credit agencies like the Louisiana Housing Corporation to underwrite these projects up front to determine whether or not they're feasible and viable at a minimum for a 10-year period. So what has to happen in underwriting these developments, there's an application that collects a lot of information that would include, what is your projected administrative and operating expenses? What is the mandated deposits to the reserves for replacement to cover the repair and replacement of significant items over that 10-year period? It could be like carpets and air conditioning that don't have a long, useful life. All of that information is collected in an application to make sure that if you get the credits from the LHC, either in the form of a 9% credit from the credit ceiling or in case of a 4% financing from an allowed credit, that the project has to work. So she said, what is the investor and the lender looking at? Okay, we're looking at new construction at $100,000 unit. I mean, we generally use rules of thumb that not less than $3,600 per unit per year. That was for years our benchmark, and you know in urban areas is much, much more, approaching $6,000 or more. So when you look at budgets, you're looking at, you know, the management, you're looking at the insurance, you're looking at the folks who are administering the office, you know, the utilities. All of these issues are embedded in an application that's collected by the LHC in an application. And then they're going to look to make sure that your reserves for replacement are sufficient to cover repairs and replacement, and also to make sure that you have an operating reserve to cover you at least for 6 to 9 months at a minimum. And so when you look at all those components of how you operate and administer that one unit, you're looking at what that unit requires in terms of the expenditure, but then you're looking at how the tax credit program actually works, which is that every tax credit unit has to be income restricted and rent restricted. And what rent restriction means, I mean, first of all, you have to have households at or below 60%, unless, and we're not going to talk about that today, we use this income averaging arrangement that was just authorized last year. But in any event, the point is that for purposes of the income, absent any type of subsidy that's like a Section 8 arrangement, the maximum rent you can charge a low-income tenant at 60% or less of area median income is 30% of what we call the imputed income of the unit occupied. What that simply means is you look at an efficiency, you assume one person at 60% occupies that unit. You look at a one-bedroom, 1.5 persons occupied. There's a schedule that basically the LHC uses, and I'm looking at Gordon King, who is the LHC's underwriter and financial advisor. His team does all of that, collects all of that data, and determines whether or not, based upon what they know, the project can generate that income. And how do they know that? Because every project is mandated to submit what is called a market study by an independent market analyst to determine that when you look at that development, that single unit can be occupied by a household at that income level. That there's a demand for that unit. If there's no demand for a unit, why would you build it? So all of this goes into how the LHC looks at and how Gordon's team evaluates these projects to come up with what Michelle said would be net operating income that lenders will use to commit funds from a hard debt point of view. And even the equity providers are looking, is this project going to work? And so this discussion today is focusing particularly on property taxes and how, and the developers here can give you some stories about the property taxes and unpredictability of property taxes. So just for a quick, and I sent you this paper that shows you the constitutional, statutory, and other authorities for how property taxes are levied. I can get into more detail later on. But essentially, what you have to understand in Louisiana, the assessors are obligated to assess properties at fair market value. The Constitution is the preeminent authority for what assessors do. And so essentially what I'm going to point out is they're obligated to assess the properties at fair market value, and then the Constitution provides for different percentages of fair market value that then goes on the property tax roll. Land, I think, is 10%, and residential improvements on land is what?
10%.
10%? All right, both 10%, I'm sorry. That being said, every 4 years, the Constitution mandates a reassessment, so the assessor does effectively every 4 years take a second look at your project, even though he may have been the same assessor and said, this is your property tax year 1. By the end of year 4, the assessor must constitutionally reevaluate that asset and determine its fair market value in the 4th year. And so what Michelle said a moment ago about uncertainty, instability, and knowing how property taxes can be budgeted into your development is an issue. Second issue, assessors have three methods of assessing properties. There is the market approach, there is the replacement cost approach, and there's the capitalized income approach. Both Errol Williams and Laura Shahardy would be here, and they would be my authority for describing to you how those methods are deployed in connection with affordable housing developments. But suffice it to say that if you think about what Michelle told you, and you look at what these affordable housing developments are all about with income and rent restrictions, it goes without saying that a replacement cost fair market valuation does not work, period, end of story. That $100,000 unit cannot be valued at $100,000 replacement cost and then result in property taxes that explode the budget. The second is comparative sales, or comparative market approach. What that means is you look at two identical projects, literally. One is market, one is tax credit. Identical in terms of the cost, and the question is, whether when you look at how the market project, which is leasing to households, all of them above 80%, 120, 140, 200% of area median income. If the assessor were to look at that development and say, oh, that unit costing $100,000 really assesses for $125,000. So what I'm trying to illustrate in that case is that if you use a market approach, it may be that the market valuations exceed even the costs to build. So that's no good. Then the next issue is capitalized income. And if you look at the Constitution, I cite for you how their mandate, I cite the statutory options to assessors. And one of the challenges that I was hoping to discuss more with Errol and with Shahardy is that no assessor is obligated to use any one of those methods as we speak. And there are actually court cases where assessors have used comparative sales and in some cases used the credits as part of their evaluation of property. There is a statute now that prohibits the use of credits and below market financing as a technique to value property, but that's only what he cannot use. It doesn't say what he must use. Part of my discussion with Errol and with Lawrence was to make clear that that was the flexibility that assessors have statewide. So in effect, the point I make here, you take an identical project costing the same in New Orleans and you put it up in Faraday. And what would be the assessed valuation of those two properties in those two environments? Don't know, but let me say it this way. Each assessor could choose one of those three methods, and legally they're authorized to do so. So I'm just giving you that as backdrop. So Michelle, what I now want to do though is just briefly say that given that uncertainty, developers have tried to deploy a range of different techniques under current law to limit how assessors determine what the property can pay as property taxes. And so there is a technique that what would otherwise be property taxes can be converted into some other payment arrangement that's akin to what is called a statutory imposition. And with that being said, what I want to do before getting into any great detail is let Tom Bay describe for you his experience with how developers have tried to deploy these financing techniques and the risks that they run and the failures of some to accommodate some technical issues. So with that, Tom, is that a good intro for you?
Sure, that works. As Wayne said, under the Constitution, the assessors have to redo the assessments every 4 years, and that's for all properties of whatever kind, in whatever their jurisdiction is. And also, as Wayne said, you've got the three primary methodologies that are used to value real property. One is the cost approach, which has never really been an issue and doesn't apply at all in this context. Second is the comparative sales approach, which is very similar to what any of y'all who have gotten a mortgage, that's, you know, where they go out and they say, okay, you've got a house located here. There's a similar house 6 blocks away that 6 months ago sold for $1 million. So then they make adjustments to it to adjust for the differences in the properties to try to come up with a value on the real property. And then the third major methodology is called the income approach, or is that one you take the income that's earned from the property and you come up with a net operating income, and then you apply a capitalization rate to that, and that gives you a value. So that's kind of overall the quick process on how that's done. Now, every year the assessors are required to open the rolls to allow a property owner to come in and look at what the value is. And generally the values don't change all that much, except in a reassessment year. But it is something I would recommend that all of you do, because there are a lot of deadlines that are triggered by the closing of that observation period. And if you don't go in and do that, especially when you're challenging the value, you can lose your right to challenge it, because there's an administrative process that you've got to go through before you can go to the courts. So it's important, it's imperative actually to maintain and be proactive on that, to go look at it, and if there's a problem, then you need to take steps to address it. One of the issues that's come up, and I'm digressing for a second here, is that, like, historically in New Orleans, we had the Big Four, the Big Six housing projects, which were owned by Hano, operated by Hano, were publicly owned properties. They weren't on the tax rolls. They were public property, which is exempt from taxation. Then when you get into the newer plans and the renovation of that, all of a sudden you go with what was public property is now private property. And so how do you address and how do you value that property on the tax rolls? That's been an issue that we've been facing in New Orleans specifically and all across the state. And actually some of these same issues have come up across the nation as these processes go through. Because essentially what the low-income housing tax credit program is trying to do a public-private partnership to encourage private equity and private investment into what has historically been a public theater. And so the more you do that, then how that impacts the taxable nature of the property has been pretty interesting.
Yeah, can you pause a moment?
Sure.
I want to, I cited the Constitution, just so everyone understands. The Constitution, it mandates all properties subject to assessment is placed on a property roll. But there are exemptions. The biggest exemption is homestead. Everybody knows that, up to $75,000. Then under section, Article 7, Section 21, there are a range of exemptions, and I've listed them in what I've circulated. And among the exemptions are, first, public lands and public property. I'm just footnoting that because what Tom just said about public housing, when public housing was owned by housing authorities, which are instrumentalities of government, they were deemed to be public property, public lands and public property. Ergo, they were wholly exempt from being placed on the assessment rolls. But then when they did the public-private partnership, because of the way the tax credit program works, the ownership, tax ownership of those improvements, not necessarily the land in the case of public housing authorities, but certainly the improvements have to be transferred to a private entity who had tax ownership in order to generate for investors these credits. So I just need to bookmark that so you understand clearly what that segue was, as Tom is now going to discuss the issues.
Okay. Well, and now there are two, assuming, let's say you go and you look at your property and all of a sudden your assessed value jumps 300% and you want to challenge that. There are really two major avenues that go down. One is called a legality challenge and the second is called a correctness challenge. And I'm not going to go into these in great detail, but a legality challenge is if you're saying that your property is exempt and the assessor has put it on the tax rolls. So that's really that. There's no, and you can go directly to the courts on that. There's no administrative exhaustion requirement, and so those are much more straightforward. It's either exempt or it's not. Although there's, as with everything in the law, there's a gray area in the middle. The second avenue is what's called a correctness challenge. That's where you're not saying that the property is exempt or is not properly on the roll, but you're saying that the value of the property, now the assessor is saying it's $200,000, and you're saying, no, that's wrong. That's way too high. I've never seen anybody, I suppose you could do it if it was too low, but I've never seen anybody do that. And so with a correctness challenge, the process you've got to go through is first you appeal it to what's called the Board of Review, which in New Orleans is the city council, or actually the city council hires a contractor who'll go through and do that. Then you can either get relief at the Board of Review stage. If you don't like that, then you can go to the Louisiana Tax Commission and have a hearing held there. And if you're still unhappy, then you can go to the courts. Going through that administrative process is a jurisdictional requirement to have judicial review, to have the courts take a look at it. That's kind of in general the process.
Can you bookmark that? Because I want to say that that's constitutionally mandated. It's really the review. It says the correctness of assessments by the assessor shall be subject to review first by the parish governing authority, then by, and this is why Louisiana Tax Commission should have been here, then by the Louisiana Tax Commission, and then finally by the courts. In all cases, and this is the important point I would emphasize, in accordance with procedures established by law. So, although the Constitution says what has to happen, when it references that by law, it opens up an avenue for clarifying how this is done, and that means that the legislature gets involved in determining the law of how assessors proceed, or how these assessments can be processed, I should say. I'm sorry, Tom.
No, that's fine. That's fine. All right, now I want to turn to kind of some of the cases that we've been dealing with in New Orleans, mostly post-Katrina, that address this. And the first case I want to talk about is one called the Abundance Square case. That one was essentially, and all of these are very fact-based. I'm not going to go into great detail on the facts, but I kind of want to give you an overview of what happened. And the Abundance Square property was in the former Desire Housing Project neighborhood. And the land there was owned still by Hanno. And Hanno leased the land to a private developer to develop affordable housing on it. And the improvements, the structures that were built on that property were not owned by Hanno, and they were not owned by any public entity. They were owned by a private entity. And so the assessor came in and said, it's a private entity, I'm going to value this 100% as a market rate unit. And the taxpayer in the Abundance Square case made an interesting argument. They said, well, it may be private property, but it's been dedicated to a public purpose. And based on some old statutory law and some old case law, that is a way to establish an exemption. Is even if you've got property that's been dedicated to a public purpose, it can be deemed to be exempt from taxation. So again, this is a legality challenge, went straight up to the courts.
Can I pause you there a moment? Because I'm a tax lawyer, and in my practice, in terms of private activity bonds versus essential function bonds, everything that we do has to have a public purpose. But there's a special category of use that's called public use. And although you said public purpose, there is, everything that is done in these areas can be deemed public purpose, but the concept of public use is one that is more precisely limited in how the courts would determine, even if the property is owned by a private entity, whether it's dedicated to public use. And the most important case was a case involving the easement of private property for a wildlife refuge, where the assessor wanted to assess the entire property,
which had been leased to the state.
No, it's not. It wasn't even leased. The state just imposed an easement, a public use easement. In which case, there was no lease, no active transfer. It was privately owned, but subject to this easement. And the court said, under those circumstances, the state has introduced an arrangement that constitutes public use for which that portion of the property is not subject to assessed valuation.
So in the Abundance Square case, the argument that the taxpayer put forward was this is public housing, and this was a mixed income facility where it had public housing units and then non-public housing units. And so the taxpayer took the position that 100% of the property should be tax exempt as dedicated to a public use. The assessor disagreed. The assessor's position, this is Assessor Williams, was at that time that, well, this is titled, it's owned by a private entity, therefore it's taxable. And the court, after going back and forth numerous times, the court finally ruled, kind of in a split the baby ruling, and said, okay, the public housing units will deem those to be dedicated to a public use and make those exempt. But the non-public housing units, whether those could be Section 8 units or they could be market rate units, but they were not public housing, were not tax exempt. So then you get a ratio of, you know, whatever the percentage, so you take the value of the property and then you determine it, you reduce it by a percentage. So that was the Abundant Square case. That was 8 or 9 years ago that came out.
Can I just read you the specific language that correlates to the public use? It says in the court decision, to the extent the plaintiffs are contractually and legally obligated to operate and maintain 48 rental units in the Abundant Square apartments and 23 in Treasure as, quote, public housing or PHA assisted units, we conclude those units have been dedicated to public use, clearly serves a public purpose, and thus are exempt from ad valorem taxes under the Louisiana Constitution. So again, the concept of public use, public purpose, all of them public purpose, but in this case, the public use component caused even, let me just throw this out because we don't have the developers who are doing the RAD, the public housing representatives, but let me say this. That decision would have been very key for how public housing authorities would finance in a public-private partnership public housing units that we did years ago, pre-Katrina, and even partially post-Katrina, where we used the capital funds and monetized those capital funds to redevelop those public housing developments and maintain them as public housing units, continuously receiving the capital funds directly from HUD, even though they were in a tax credit partnership, pursuant to a regulatory and operating agreement that correlated to the language I just cited. But you know that we have evolved how we finance public housing. The current programs are now rental assistance demonstration, RAD. What is that? Essentially, it's a program that converts those capital funds to Section 8 project-based contracts. It eliminates the language in the regulatory and operating agreement that would have been consistent with this state Supreme Court decision that would have avoided them being subject to any property taxes. But now with the Section 8 contracts, there's no protection. And the concepts embedded in abundance are no longer applicable to public housing redevelopment under the RAD program. I just want to point that out because there's a lot going on there.
There's a lot going on in all of this stuff. So that was, and then the Court of Appeals, well, I should say the trial court in the Abundant Square case actually ruled in favor of the assessor and said it was all taxable, and then that was reversed by the Court of Appeals, who came up with the division of public housing versus non-public housing. The first one of these that I actually handled was the St. Bernard case, which was the more traditional low-income housing tax credit structure. Again, the property, the land that was at issue was owned by Hano. It was leased to the taxpayer and then subsequently to the Industrial Development Board, who then subleased it back to the taxpayer. And through this structure, the intent of the structure was to have the property be, have the improvements of the property be owned by the Industrial Development Board, which would be then not subject to taxation because it would be public property, but it would be subject to a pilot agreement or a payment in lieu of taxes. Assessor Williams came in and said, no, I don't think that structure is, I don't think what you intended is what actually happened. And so he was trying to argue that the property was not owned by the Industrial Development Board, but was actually owned by the private taxpayer, which is, and I'm just going to use taxpayer because there are 1,000 LLC names involved here. And the result of that would be going essentially from whatever the pilot was, the payment in lieu of taxes requirement, to a full market property tax, which would have thrown the budget which had been previously agreed to and previously calculated based on the pilot. And now all of a sudden you've got this vastly increased property tax bill, and it threw the budget, or would have potentially thrown the budget into chaos. So the assessor raised a couple issues. He raised that the transfer documents didn't validly transfer ownership of the property to the Industrial Development Board. And then he also raised an issue with a split ownership, which is not consistent with Louisiana law, but under the interplay between Louisiana ad valorem tax law and federal income tax, one can be deemed an owner under federal income tax law solely because you have a long-term interest, even a leasehold interest. You have control of the property. Under Louisiana law, title's title. Whether you have it or not is the determinative factor. And so what Assessor Williams tried to argue in that case was that we had somehow split ownership between state ownership and federal ownership, not recognizing that that really wasn't the case. It was all owned by the IDB, but it was leased to the taxpayer. Eventually, the trial court ruled in favor of the taxpayer that the improvements were owned by the IDB. And so that was, now we're going to go back to St. Bernard in a minute because we weren't quite done with the assessor yet on that project. But that was, we're then getting.
Who would have been here but for his sickness today?
Right.
We would have stuck it to him.
And then similarly, there was another one, again, same situation. It was the Fisher Housing Project, which is on the West Bank in New Orleans, which again was a project owned by Hanno and then leased through various structures. And the assessor tried, again, challenged the ownership of the improvements. And after originally the assessor prevailed on a summary judgment in the district court. We then got that overturned on the Court of Appeals, who said, look, the documents say what the documents say. But the Court of Appeals found that there was a question of fact that needed to be addressed. And then that case was settled after that.
So that wasn't an IDB issue? It was
No, the IDB was not involved in Fisher. The IDB was involved in Fisher. So that was an ownership issue. But it was just what was the impact of the various leases and who had ownership
I was involved in all of those cases, by the way. But Tom and his firm actually had to correct my notions of ownership between federal and state tax law. And Tom literally pulled my butt out of the furnace on the St. Bernard, if I'm not mistaken. But again, we've learned, and now the court decisions have evolved very clear. There is no question that you can have public use without public ownership, as I cited in the case of the easement. But in the case of exemption, where there is no public use, remember that, public use, but there's a public purpose, the issue of how do you achieve exemptions for properties that achieve public purposes when they are owned by private interest. And so I'm going to let, because I want to cite some specific issues that some of you, particularly nonprofits, have to take into account that may not be as apparent to some of you as they are now to me.
Has anybody thought about having the LIHTC credit be declared a public use easement?
Let me say this: it has to be sourced in the Constitution first. And part of what you need to understand is that when you look at the exemptions, and if you read what I circulated to you, particularly when you go to Article 7, Section 21B1, and it says as follows, in addition to homestead exemptions, it says property owned by nonprofit corporation organized and operated exclusively for charitable purposes, I'm skipping language, charitable purposes, no part of the net earnings of which inure to the benefit of any private shareholder or member thereof, and which is declared to be exempt from federal or state income tax. That's sort of like the bedrock of how you get 501c3 ownership exempt from property taxes. There is a case that I cited in the printout material under the constitutional case law, which, Kathy, you're familiar with, when you look at nonprofit corporations that create wholly owned subsidiaries under federal income tax law that are deemed to be disregarded entities, like an LLC. So a 501c3 owns an LLC to own the project, and that LLC has the same tax status for federal income tax purposes as the parent, but it doesn't have a specific exemption either under federal or state law from income tax.
But there are states that have exemptions when a nonprofit controls the LLC.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, Louisiana is just not one of them.
What Michelle said, and I actually did research, and I prepared a paper on that ultimately, but I did research what other states do and how they do it. But in the case of Louisiana, it's important to understand that when you're in Louisiana, the preeminent authority is the Constitution, followed by statutes, and then jurisprudence. And the point I'm trying to emphasize here is that there is a case that says very clearly that the Constitution is strictly construed in effect, that notwithstanding this LLC having a tax exemption for federal income tax purposes, there's no language in the Constitution that says an LLC is a nonprofit corporation or association. Ergo, even though it's exempt from federal income tax, it's not exempt under our constitutional property tax purposes. So the point to answer that question for you, Kathy, is as follows. It's not that low-income housing tax credits can be deemed public use, because they cannot be. And it's not that taxpayers that, or public-private partnerships can be routinely exempt, because the Constitution strictures won't permit that unless we change the Constitution. The ultimate question is, when you look at tax credit property, you use by analogy this nonprofit, when a tax credit with nonprofits being the sole general partner with investors coming in, you're looking at revenues and income that inures to investors, clearly contravening what a nonprofit can do. So how do you think a nonprofit can't get away with it, but a for-profit could? No way. I don't see that happening. So that's the answer to your question. But to get back to the issue that we're trying to address is this. The other states have looked at how they can do this. There are arrangements, as Michelle said, in other states, how tax credit properties can avail themselves of some form of top property tax relief. And remember, I cited the provisions of how some of these arrangements can be determined by law. I know we're getting late. I'm going to let Tom finish, and you can ask questions. But here's my view, because frankly, I've done legislative work for 7 years in the U.S. Senate. I've drafted legislation here. I know how it can be done. Frankly, I would mandate that all assessors statewide must use the net income approach and capitalized net income approach for assessing tax credit properties. But I would literally, in the statute, provide for how the capitalization rate is to be determined for purposes of how you value those properties in conjunction with the underwriting the LHC does. Now, here's the challenge. You have mixed income. And part of what I circulated to you is, and let me give a little background. Years and years ago, I used to do a lot more than I do today, but I worked with Treasury and IRS. This Rep Proc that you see in the back, 9632, that's the outcome of discussion when I was chairman of the ADA Forum, discussion with Lynn and Deborah Kowecki. They were married. One was in Treasury, one was in IRS. This is a safe harbor for how housing can be owned and operated by a 501c3 organization, which would be deemed charitable per se. And included in that is an arrangement that you have to have at least 75% of the units occupied by households at or below 80%, with 25% not subject to any income restriction. Within the total project, you have to select or elect a 20-50 or 40-60 rule consistent with how you elect the set-asides under the tax credit program or the bond program for that matter. And so the theory here is, and that's why I had questions for Errol and had questions for the chairman of the tax commission. I mean, what is charitable when a nonprofit owns housing? Do you go by that safe harbor in Rep Proc 9632? And when you look at the constitutional provision, remember that there are other ways you can get housing to be charitable under the Rep Proc, but for a single standalone housing development, it's the safe harbor that I just described. Query whether we can use that as the paradigm for essentially saying these developments with these configurations or satisfying charitable purposes that we can then use simultaneously to arrange for the assessors to utilize this structure to give some form of property tax relief pursuant to how LHC underwrites, determines net income, and determines what the capitalization rate, subject to continuous monitoring that there's compliance with that arrangement. My point, and I had questions for Assessor Williams and Jahardi, was, what instructions do they now have? I talked to Williams this morning. I said, Errol, you have two identical projects in New Orleans, one in Uptown, one in the Ninth Ward. Every respect they're the same in terms of their costs, in terms of their budgets, etc., and net income. Would you value them differently? He said, yes. You heard me? He said, yes. Why? Because for some reason, proximity to higher income developments causes him to feel that a different capitalization rate is appropriate in Uptown versus what's in the Ninth Ward. Why is that the case? It actually erodes the public purpose or the policy arguments for putting these developments in, what do you call, opportunity zone areas. It doesn't make any sense. I shouldn't say it doesn't make any sense, but it certainly doesn't serve public policy purposes. Likewise, I was going to ask Jahardi, he said, well, do you give them any instruction? And he said, the answer is no. And I asked Errol, do you get instruction from the tax commission as to what you must do with affordable housing developments? He says, no, I can do whatever I want. He doesn't have to use capitalized income or capitalized net income.
Well,
he could go, I'm saying he doesn't have to.
He's not legally required
That's
to,
the
but
point.
the way the case law has come out and the way that the Louisiana Tax Commission's authority of review is such that they're doing that now. But
we talk about upfront, that the only way that the tax commission gets involved, given the Constitution and the appeal process, it has to first go through the governing authority, then to the
tax commission,
and then to the courts. And so you're not guaranteed a consistent and standard result that investors and lenders would like to see in how they commit to affordable housing developments. But we have a strategy to deal with that.
So I follow you thinking, so if you put some numbers to it, generally speaking, what would the valuation be and what would the whole dollars in taxes be if you wanted to use some basic example?
Well, let's
well,
put
it depends on, the valuation's going to be is fair market value of the property. So however that is determined, and that's the three methodologies we talked about that they come up with a valuation. And then that is, the assessment is a ratio, a percentage of that and that's what the actual taxes are based on. Then the millage, which is going to be applied to the assessment, varies by jurisdiction, but that's generally pretty easy to make a determination of what the millage rate is going to be. If you go to Orleans Parish or St. Tammany Parish or wherever you are, you can make that determination. Now, it's not going to say that the millage rate isn't going to change, but it doesn't fluctuate hugely. And then the percentages of the assessment to the value is set out in the Constitution. So the real variable in this is going to be the value of the property.
which is function in the capitalized income of determining what net income is. That's critical. You have to first determine what the net income of each property is, and each property is different, and that's the point I'm emphasizing here. And the underwriting under Section 42M of the Code mandates an underwriting that effectively looks at all of these details, and to the extent that we do consider some legislation to mandate the use of capitalized income for affordable housing developments, however we define them, with tax credits, only with tax credits, because there's statute that says you don't use the credits or below market federal loans for property determination purposes. But my point is focusing solely on tax credit projects which have these 15-year minimum compliance periods with an extended use of another 15 years, as Michelle said. Let's figure out a way that we determine how do we assess net income across all properties and what would be the capitalization rate that would be appropriate given how these properties operate. That's the starting point, not fair market value, net income. That's where you got to start.
Well, yeah. I mean, the net operating income is the basic source feed for the capitalized income valuation approach. I want to close out. We talked about Fisher. On the last one on the legality issue is the Fillmore Park case, and that one differs a little bit in that that was not ever Hano property. That the ground itself was owned by the private entity who built the improvements, built the affordable housing on it, and then the assessor came in and assessed it at a market rate unit, and they said no, this is affordable housing, and so under Abundant Square, parts of it were dedicated to a public use, so it should be exempt. That one has gone back and forth a couple times up to the Court of Appeals, and is now back in the district court for additional evidence on whether it's really a public use or not, and how these particular units are being used and how the structure is. So that one's still in play, but the main distinction between that one and the Abundant Square case is that one, the land was owned by Hano, the other one it was privately owned. So that's kind of the area where the legality challenges have been coming up, and that's somewhat interesting, but in my opinion, it's not as interesting as the correctness challenges. Yes, sir.
I want to say, before going forward, I really believe the distinction between public use and public purpose is an important distinction, because all tax credit properties are subject to public use under federal tax law, which means, in effect, you cannot restrict them, except that today, there are two statutory exceptions to public use under Section 42. It's for the artists and for special needs. And today, literally, on my email, I got from the IRS a reference to something that was released today that provides that veterans, or an exception, would permit dedication to veterans as consistent with public use for federal fair housing purposes. So the point I'm making here is that for federal tax purposes, you must make all units available to the public within the income ranges that are required, but that you cannot dedicate any units in your tax credit developments to anyone other than to special needs, to like the elderly. It's consistent with the fair housing law, and an HRI, Press Kapikoff, arranged exception for artists that he specialized in New Orleans. And as of today, notwithstanding what Section 42 permitted on veterans, 142 did not, and now IRS has come out and said if you do a bond financing that allows credits and you can dedicate units to veterans, you can do so now. So I think, though, a point I'm emphasizing that in state law, I don't believe that the understanding of public use is the same understanding as what happens in federal tax law under the Fair Housing Act, so that for purposes of that reference I mentioned earlier to 501c3, that private annulment and private benefit, particularly since there will be release mechanisms so that surplus cash that generally is released in these tax credit developments per the investor-lender requirements to let 25% not go to any specific debt service, that arrangement itself is going to nullify the concept of public use under the Constitution.